What if I told you that there's a mobility drill that you desperately need, but there's a 99% chance you've never heard of it? Well, today we're going to first do a mobility test to see if you've lost a critical aspect of hip mobility. Then we're going to show you 2 exercises to restore that motion and get your hips feeling 10 years younger. And make sure you watch to the end where I'll show you what you need to do to keep this movement restriction from coming back. Let's go ahead and dive into it. By the time you hit your 30s, you've probably noticed that your body isn't bouncing back the way it used to. Here's where I'm gonna be brutally honest. You probably can't pass this hip mobility test that I'm about to show you. Here's the test. Stand tall and lift your knee up to a 90-degree angle. You can hold on to something if you need to. Now I want you to slowly move your leg out to the side. What we wanna see to pass this test is a smooth 30 degrees or more range of motion. Now it's important that we do this test the right way. A failed test would involve not marching the knee all the way up to 90 degrees. Also, it involved rotating less than 30 degrees out to the side. Another way to fail this test is by hiking the hip up to fake extra motion. Or if you're getting any sort of hip pinch in the front of the hip, that's another indication of failing this test. Another way to confirm this test is by putting one leg out straight, bending one knee to about 90 degrees, and then letting this knee come across the body. If we have good hip internal rotation, greater than 30 degrees on the other side, you should see that this knee can come all the way across the opposite thigh without the hip leaving the ground. If you're lacking hip internal rotation, maybe you were 10 or 15 degrees on the other test, a way to confirm that would be here. We probably would see that that knee won't come in farther than about to the inside of this thigh without this hip coming off the ground. And I do want you to notice as well if there's a side-to-side difference between your hips. Okay, so what did we just test and why is it important? We tested hip internal rotation range of motion. This is the ability of the hip socket to internally rotate or to move the femur towards the middle of the body. A lot of people lack this range of motion. And why is that motion important? Well, hip internal rotation is required for hip flexion, especially squatting beyond 90 degrees. As the hip goes into flexion, the hip needs to internally rotate to go through that motion. Also, as the hip fully extends, it needs to internally rotate to run and jump. There are also a ton of other sport and life movements like change of direction, swinging a golf club, and even cycling that require hip internal rotation range of motion. Basically, you use hip internal rotation for a lot of movements, and when you don't have it, your body feels stiff and it has to compensate. Now you might be wondering, why do most people in their 30s lose hip internal rotation? A wide range of lower body injuries ranging from ankle sprains, pulled hamstrings, jumper's knee, and more cause the hip to stiffen up and lose this critical aspect of mobility. Hip internal rotation is something that I always address and work to restore after an injury, but in many cases this is lost and never restored. This could also be from a number of other reasons, one of which is the progressive loss of hip internal range of motion over time from lifestyle factors like sitting a lot and never really putting your body into the position. This typically starts to creep up on you and become problematic in your 30s. Okay, but let's get to the exercises to fix this, because I find that a lot of people who lack hip internal rotation end up with instability on one leg, for example during lunges, often a band of tension around the lower back, and loss of shoulder external rotation range of motion on the opposite side of the tight hip. If we address the root problem, which is that hip internal rotation, we can see a lot of these other related symptoms go away as well. So how do we fix it? Well, the good news is you can start to see progress almost immediately. I have 2 exercises that are absolute game changers. I want you to make sure that you test your hip internal rotation range of motion before and after to see if these drills actually work for you. All right, let's jump into the first exercise, the offset hip hinge. We're gonna show you how to improve Katie's left hip internal rotation. So if that left hip is limited, we're gonna start with both heels against the wall and then step the left foot 1 foot away from the wall. So 1 foot length away from the wall, and this is the foot that's gonna stay on the ground and we're gonna use to hinge on. The opposite foot, we're gonna push the heel into the wall. So that's where we get our offset position. From here, we're gonna do a single leg hip hinge, focusing on moving the hip crease back towards the wall. We're gonna keep the chest tall and slowly hinge forward. Now, to really make this address hip internal rotation, we're gonna take the opposite arm and we're gonna reach down to the knee. Then this hinge is gonna be a slow reach, tracing the fingertips down the shin. So we're gonna slowly trace the fingertips down the shin. Katie's making one big mistake that we wanna correct, and that is pushing the knee back. So instead, we actually want to push the knee forward and keep it over the shoelaces. And this will probably take a few sets to really get used to the motion. So let's show you again. We're taking the opposite hand to the kneecap, and then we're tracing the fingertips down the shin. If we're doing this right, we should feel a stretch at one specific point in the back of the hips that we could put 1 or 2 fingers on. So I really want you to get to that bottom position and hold it and see if you can feel that stretch in the back of the hip. So what you want to do is make sure that your hip crease is going back, make sure that your kneecap is staying forward, and then we're rotating and reaching across to really get that stretch in the very back of the hip. So I want you to focus on doing 8 to 10 repetitions, nice and slow and controlled, and holding that bottom position for 1 or 2 seconds, really feeling the stretch in the back of the hip. Make sure the big toe stays down to the ground and there's weight on the inside of your foot. It can often help to do a big deep exhale at that bottom position to make sure you're really getting to that stretch. If you're really struggling with this movement, just start with a 2-foot hip hinge, stepping 1 foot away from the wall and then hinging at your hips and focusing on pushing your hips back towards the wall without letting your knees drift back. Once you really master that 2-foot hip hinge, go back to that 1 foot with the offset, reach across, and work till you get to that deep stretch in the back of the hip. To really get to improving hip internal rotation, we do need to get to one leg and reaching across so that we can really open up that range of motion. I would recommend working on this for 2 to 3 minutes and then retesting your range of motion. So now once you've worked on that for 2 to 3 minutes, go back and retest your range of motion again to see if your hip internal rotation range of motion improved or not. When we did this in our live hip mobility masterclass, we had tons of comments of people saying that their hip mobility improved significantly. A lot of people also said that they had similar range of motion, but it felt better. This is also a good indication, and in that case, you may need to work on the next exercise as well. Okay, now let's jump into the second exercise, the posterior hip capsule stretch. This one is going to target the muscles on the back side of the hip. So in order for the hip to internally rotate, we need to lengthen these muscles on the back side. It's a series of muscles and structures, that's why we collectively call it the hip posterior capsule. And that's what we're gonna target with this next stretch. All right, now I'm gonna walk you through the hip posterior capsule stretch, and I'll do it with you. Get onto all fours and then take one knee up and across the body. From here, we're gonna focus on sinking your hips back. And to get the most out of this stretch, we want to have some space between the knees, so we really want to work that opposite knee across. Now, already in this position, I can start to feel that stretch right here in the back of the hip. That's exactly what we're going for. To make sure that we're getting that stretch, we want that opposite hip to be down towards the ground, and we want to be pushing our hips backwards. The whole point is to bring this knee across the body and to get that stretch in the very back of the hip. So find your position, big deep exhales, tilting the hips back slightly can help, and then again moving the back knee apart and back. You want to get to a position where you feel a good stretch and then take big deep exhales to help yourself relax into that position and further into that stretch. Focus on getting into position and then sinking into that stretch slowly with those deep exhales. Again, spend 2 to 3 minutes on this stretch and then retest your hip internal rotation range of motion to see if it improved. I had one client who was really limited and had -5 degrees of hip internal rotation, but this stretch got him to over 10 degrees of hip internal rotation in just about 2 or 3 minutes. I wish I would have recorded his reaction. He said it made his hip immediately feel better. Chances are you'll see at least 5 to 10 degrees improvement in range of motion from this drill. That's a good indication that you might have some restriction in that posterior hip capsule and you need to spend some time working on it. With each of these exercises, I would recommend training these for 2 to 3 minutes at the start of your workout 3 or 4 times per week. Do this consistently for several weeks. Okay, now you might be saying, wow, this improved my range of motion temporarily, but how do I make sure that this movement restriction doesn't come back? Well, a good way to do this is to make sure that you're using that new range of motion and strengthening it in your workouts. You can do that by including exercises like a reverse lunge with rotation, a full depth squat, or a high step up into your training program. by improving the range of motion with the drills that we showed you, then strengthening that new range of motion with exercises that use those positions, you'll find that your hips feel better and they stay that way long term. Your 30s don't have to be a decade where your body starts to fall apart. With the right techniques, you can keep moving well, keep lifting, and most importantly, keep enjoying life. If you're a trainer like me and you enjoy learning these biomechanics-based techniques to help your clients' movement, make sure you check out our full hip mobility masterclass. I'll leave a link in the description below. Drop a comment below if you have any questions about hip mobility or the techniques we covered today, or if there's another video you want me to cover, for example, focusing on the hip flexors or the hamstrings. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed that video, smash the like button. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.